On the map that follows, it shows colonial trade between Spain and the Americas. And there are some things I'd like to point out here. One thing, you can think of Pirates of the Caribbean or something like that, exciting stuff. And you'll see that the Spanish did face the threat of piracy. And so what they developed in order to try and combat this threat is a Spanish fleet system. And if you look at the map here, you'll see that the point where they met was in Havana. All the silver and gold from the Americas would be shipped to Havana, and at Havana they would meet up with a very well-armed, fortified fleet system and travel across the Atlantic Ocean together to Spain. We start to see the development of mercantilist policies here because Spain wanted its own fleet system to maintain control over the cash flow. So the Spanish mine owners in the Americas could not trade with anybody else. They had to put all their silver and gold on Spanish ships that would be protected by the Spanish fleet system that would take all their stuff over to Spain, at least in theory. What actually ends up happening, and this map shows it pretty well, is that from Peru, you can see Potosi on there, and the silver that's being shipped out of Potosi to the coast. A lot of that actually ends up foregoing this Spanish fleet system and instead is traded more directly to Manila, to China, to Japan off the west coast. But officially, we've got 1/5 of everything being paid to the Spanish crown and all of the silver and gold being transported via the Spanish fleet system over to Spain. The next slide shows map 2, and for our purposes, you don't need to memorize each one of these viceroyalties or be able to say a lot about the Spanish colonial administration. But it is important to realize that Spain had the big chunk of the Americas according to this line of demarcation from 1494 that was set in place by the Treaty of Tordesillas. Essentially what the Spanish king and queen had done is appeal to the Pope after Columbus's infamous expedition in 1492 and try to claim all the territories in the Americas. But the Pope, sight unseen, tried to divide the Americas between two prominent Catholic empires, the Portuguese and the Spanish. So this line was supposed to be actually an equal, more or less equal division of the territories, but because our explorers didn't know the shape and the contours of the Americas yet, it's rather lopsided in favor of Spain. So you have this little portion that'll become Brazil was allocated to the Portuguese, and the rest, this big chunk, was allocated to Spain. And the Spanish administration set it up as two big viceroyalties, the Viceroyalty of New Spain and the Viceroyalty of Peru, and administered it through a Council of Indies based in Spain. Over time, the economy changes in these Spanish holdings. So 1500s, early 1600s, there's a lot of emphasis on mining, particularly of silver. But over time, what happens is what's coming out of the mines becomes less and less pure. It ends up costing a lot more money over time to send Native American laborers down because you have to dig deeper and deeper and deeper. And also there are more revolts. The labor supply is less sure. So by the 1700s, roughly 80% of Spanish settlers are actually involved in agricultural production, and there's not as much emphasis on mining. Now, these Spanish settlers built what are known as haciendas, these large agricultural estates. And if you think about haciendas in contrast to the plantation societies we'll see in Brazil and in the Caribbean, these haciendas, while they were devoted to agriculture, were not used to produce cash crops. Instead, they were producing things that were mostly consumed in the Americas. There was some growing of sugar and cacao, but mostly they're producing the basic needs that they need to sustain themselves. And they were trading regionally, but in general did not trade across the Atlantic back to Spain. So I've given you some hints that there was resistance to Spanish coercion and Spanish colonial rule. So if you flip to the next slide, you'll see a very well-known example of resistance to Spanish colonial rule. And this was organized by Tupac Amaru II. And he was actually a mestizo who claimed both Spanish descent and then also direct descent from the last Incan emperor. And when the Peruvian Empire was defeated by the Spanish, his family apparently went into exile and waited to make their move. So one of the things that Tupac Amaru II is focused on is the system of the mita, this forced labor system. And it had been officially abolished in the territories where he was living in 1720. But a lot of Native Americans, even though it had been abolished, still worked in forced labor situations in mines or in emerging textile mills or else on haciendas. So Tupac Amaru started at first to petition the Spanish crown, and there's an example of that on the next slide, so we'll look at that in a minute. But his petitions didn't get him anywhere, so he led an armed rebellion in 1780 that made a really big impact. It eventually spread to more than 24 states, and the rebels did win victory against Spanish soldiers. But over time, the Spanish returned with more troops, and they brutally repressed the rebellion. They claimed to not be able to figure out who were rebels and who was general civilian population. So the general thing they did was just kill any Native American. So the estimates are that they killed more than 100,000 Native Americans, about 8% of the population at the time in these rebelling states. And this included actually Tupac Amaru II and his family. The Spanish captured him and forced him to witness the execution of his family, including his wife and his son. Then they cut out his tongue. He was quartered. His arms and legs were attached to horses, and the horses were driven in different directions. Apparently, after he was drawn and quartered, he was still alive, so they beheaded him for good measure. So this shows that there was a tradition of resistance, and that usually this resistance was met with brutal Spanish methods. So if you flip to the next slide, you'll see one example of Tupac Amaru II's petitions, and you'll see that he was educated in Spanish. He is appealing to the King of Spain, and he's also identifying himself as the legitimate heir to the Incan Empire, and he's claiming that the kings of Castile have usurped his crown and burdened his people with taxes, tributes, customs houses, commercial duties, monopolies, taxes, tithes, the royal fifth. The viceroys and audiencias are referring to different Spanish colonial administrators, as are the corregidors. Those were people who came to collect mita workers, and Tupac Amaru is claiming that all of them were equal in tyranny. But ultimately, what he's also saying is that the Spanish king has no authority and no legitimacy in that area because he, Tupac Amaru, is the rightful heir. So one of the things that Tupac Amaru tried to do is use Spanish elements of his identity and his education to appeal to the King of Spain as a fellow Spaniard. But this petition doesn't change things, so Tupac Amaru led his rebellion and was eventually executed.